So welcome to this event called They Are Threatening Us, the Centrality of Threat Perceptions in Protracted Violent Conflict. I'm Daniel Rothbart, Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at the Carter School. This event is one of 30 events this week for Peace Week, the theme of which is what works, building peace at home and in the world in challenging times. And as most of you know, Peace Week has basically showcases the innovative research and practices of both Carter School faculty and students, as well as scholar practitioners from around the world. It is a pleasure to facilitate this event and to see in this list people who I know, and I would like to meet people who I'm seeing their names for the first time. We are so grateful for the organizers of Peace Week, including Amber Williams, who is a master at facilitating all of the background, excitement, and that reflects her skills in organizing all the events of Peace Week this semester. So this event, as I mentioned, is entitled "They Are Threatening Us," and the underlying kind of assumption here is that threats, perceived threats among conflict actors are not only widespread in cases of protracted violent conflict, but really go to the core, are central to their sense of their mission, of who they are, of how they relate to their perceived enemies. It is kind of central to their very existence. And it is a pleasure to have my colleagues at this event who are experts in this topic among many, many other topics. My colleague, Professor Karina Korstalina, is a professor of conflict analysis and resolution here at the Carter School, and her list of accomplishments and productivity is amazing. It would certainly take the time of this entire event if I listed that. And she is going to be speaking on the intersection of threat and collective memory. Also, it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Dennis Klein, who is a scholar in residence at the Carter School for this semester. He is a professor of history at Keene University in New Jersey. It is wonderful to have Dennis here, who's already been very active in contributing significantly to the intellectual life of our school. He will be examining the centrality of bystanders who are perceived to be threatening from the perspective of some conflict actors. So what we're going to do, and also may I mention, it is wonderful to have Matt Berry, who is here, a recent graduate of the doctoral program, who will also be with me facilitating this event. So what we're going to do is go in sequence, Karina first, then Dennis, and then I will speak on the centrality of threats in the context of right-wing extremists in the United States. So we'll go in sequence. Feel free to include your questions or comments in the chat, and then we will address those after the three speakers present their findings. So we'll go in sequence, and then we'll have a discussion based on your questions and comments. And so let us start right now. So, Karina.
So then it's what, 15-20 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes.
Good. Good. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will be speaking about intersection between identity, history, and threat in the dynamics of conflict based on my forthcoming book on memory sites. So when we speak about how conflict function within the space on history memory, we see multiple fields of multiple areas where we can study as area for understanding of these interactions. So first of all, we speak about collective memory as functioning within particular group of people. I'll speak more about it. We can study it through history education, through official historical narratives of the government, promoted by government, by leadership, and also by memory sites and museums. I've done a lot of work on history education. I've done some work on official historical narratives. This particular presentation is about functioning of memory sites and museums. And while there are so much research done on functioning of national identity, development of national identity, addressing racial, ethnic, and other inequalities through history and museums, still very small scholarships exist on idea how conflict and conflict resolution can be promoted through memory sites and museums. So then we speak about this idea of intersection between history and memory. What we found here is that interpretation of the past is critical for understanding of dynamics of identity-based conflict. That's why mostly every single state, except 3 states of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, control their history education. You see this now conflicts going around the United States and multiple states about what to teach, what history to teach. So it's very key for understanding of dynamics of identity-based conflict. But what more important for us and more interesting for us as a scholars of conflict analysis and resolution is the dynamic of identity-based conflict influence interpretation of history. So what events will be presented, how they will be interpreted, what will be silenced, what will be removed, this and how it will be presented. So this is a very important dependent on dynamics of identity-based conflict. So what we're really talking about is unpredictable past, because we never know what history will be presented in the future. So historical narratives themselves, usually classical idea that we're moving from past to present to the future. But in reality, what we see is that present, past, and future really influence each other, because historical narrative is central for process of social identity formation and the group relation. They have 3 major functions, mechanisms. They have they create connotations of the meaning of in-group identity, establish a vision of in-group shared future. So history is much more important for the normative prescriptions of future rather than presentation of the past. They also define attitudes toward outgroup, establish criteria of comparison with outgroups. And so it really impacts intergroup relations, because what people remember from history is not dates and names. They remember specific connotation of intergroup relations, and then become belief, deep belief that impact not only people attitudes, but also their behavior. And finally, we're speaking about normative idea. It's legitimization of group position, specific actions toward outgroup, shaping the distribution of power and authority, patterns of exclusion and inclusion. So few words about collective memory, because I will be speaking about it as a process within conflict dynamics. So I love this picture. This is exactly how collective memory function, because it's continuous reconstruction of representation of the past. It's not just something we remember and passive. It's actually active process of engagement in the efforts after meaning. It's meaning making of the past, very important process which make us help us to actually make sense of what's happening right now and where we're going. It's also always, there are a lot of research done on complexity of this process, cognitive complexity, because it's reorganizing information, reconstruction, uniting some coherent narrative, because there are multiple events which happen, how you unite them. And sometimes, as we know, it could be very ironic, for example, then people in multiple situations trying to explain current situations going to the past, but from the point of the current situation. For example, nation building process stretched back to the past, where Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Georgian historians were fighting with each other who was first Neanderthal. Was it Azerbaijani, Armenian, or Georgian for the first introductory chapter for common textbook, stretching the nation building to prehistoric time. They're also speaking about collective memory is rituals and public commemorations. It's not just discourses. It's very important processes of engagement with history and transmission of collective memory. And what is important that they don't have to be true. They just have to be compelling. They have to be coherent for people to accept them as a truth. What is important for us as conflict resolution people, that collective memory belongs to mnemonic communities. It does not function separately from the groups, and there is no one collective memory of a nation. So each individual depends on collective memory of their groups, and it's usually create social networks and social cultural environment of these mnemonic communities. So what is important that it's not equally shared in society. Instead, they distribute it across different groups, creating overlapping but mostly often competing accounts of the past. So usually a lot of research shows that then reinforce political agenda, ideological position of ruling power. There are so many research on it, but recently more and more research start actually showing that they are institution of meaning making, social interaction, reflection on what's happening. They also places of reinterpretation and contestation. They challenge conflict dynamic and legitimacy of the groups. And there are communities who now have opportunity and right to actually engage with and create and challenge this particular memory sites, addressing their needs of trauma healing, reckoning with history and violence. So in this situation, we see that this memories not only shape division and ignite violence, but also can contribute to reconciliation and address trauma. So when I speak about memory sites, in my book, I speak about 5 major components, including social boundary, relative deprivation, collective axiology, forms of power, but today I will be concentrating specifically on outgroup threat. So outgroup threat, as Dan noticed, is powerful predictor of intergroup prejudice and conflict behavior. And research identifies 5 types of threat: realistic threat to existence, to power, well-being of a group; symbolic threat to values, morals, worldviews of the group; threats to intergroup distinctiveness and social boundary, where people are afraid that another group become too similar, what Volkan was calling phenomenon of minor differences; and a threat to social identity or group esteem, which can arise from perception that in-group identity is devaluated by the others; and finally, threats to group status, social standing, and position within social hierarchy. So integrated theory, threat theories shows that threat can be influenced by 4 types of factors: intergroup relations, individual differences, variables, but what is more important for us as scholars, again, of conflict analysis and resolutions, and cultural dimension and historic factors play a very important role in defining how threat function. So I will explain this functioning of the threat through 4 major functions which I identify for historic sites. First of all, historic sites can play enhancing function for identity. They can utilize favorable comparison with outgroup, decreasing their value, decreasing their position in society, biased negative representation. So they stress threat to identity, because in this situation, then historic site, this particular memory sites or historic preservation sites impact identity and the representation of identity. Usually group in power, group who has access to it, resist change or trying to present outgroup particular way, because this memory sites posit important threat to representation of their identity. So they try to use multiple favorable comparison. Otherwise, for conflict resolution, there are more and more examples how glorification of in-group, reduction of this threat to identity can come without out-group derogation. And examples I present here, there are multiple examples because of the time, I will pick several. For example, in Dubrovnik, I see here, people can recognize probably this, there are still a lot of representations, even within the city itself. There are museums of civic war, there are the Serbs represented extremely negatively, and there is a clear one-sided narrative about what happens and about the civic war and other examples. Still, even in history textbook on both Serbia and Croatia, we see extremely one-sided representation of threat. For example, they show for 10-year children, they show pictures of boiled people. Yes, it did happen, but put it like full-size picture for third grader to emphasize the threat. So majority of people who present in history textbooks are warriors who defended the country, or those who were negative, were posited threat for them. Good example, which I want to show, this is Museum of Churchill in the United States, where it's one of the most popular museums actually in United Kingdom, where people come to understand his life, his contribution to the country, but it does not develop particular enemy or does not represent particular group as negative. Even he went through a lot of very complex events with out group. it's mostly concentrated on the idea of what does it mean to be good citizen of United Kingdom? What does it mean to contribute to the country? So it's very different approach where identity is not threatened of any other groups. Similar in Cambodia, the new first then the restoration was developed. Oh my gosh, I need to move. Okay, I will skip this example. One of the great example is critical approach to history through Arizona 9/11 memorial, where multiple ways of representation together with positive ways like mass bomb, like Middle East violence motivates attack in the US. You don't win battles, terrorism with more battles. So you see a lot of different approaches with criticism of what United States did, but also with trauma representation, trauma healing, like God bless America, and so United we stand, and so on. Second important is symbolic threats, and they manifest through ascribing function. So one way what history and memory sites can do is erase collective memory of outgroup, present it as homogeneous evil, or even deny victimhood of these people, or represent them as open for change and promote recognition and trauma healing. So what we see, for example, in Australian delayed garden, the history of Australia is represented only by basically white European people. There were no any representation of native Australians. Now it's changing, but for a long time this particular garden was very important, erasing because it was a symbolic threat to the idea how Australia was developed as a country. But very good examples of it, for example, is museum. They now change in the way how we look into memorials in the United States, where Native Indians it's represented in a way that they are weak or not able to resist or not able to be equal. So there are a lot of removal of this particular representation of Native Americans. And interesting example is African Burial Ground National Monument. When they start building the federal court, they found that there are a lot of remains of African Americans. So there was a lot of resistance, a lot of fight around it, but finally it was designated as a National Historic Landmark, which represent contribution of African Americans into the development of the city. It's emphasize history of slavery, but also show the ability of African Americans to contribute to the development of the city. I go very quickly to more function. Interaction function, it's really threat to outgroup clear threat or reduce perception of threat and relative deprivation. And again, as we see, for example, in Northern Ireland, long after resolution of this conflict, we see multiple representation of threats. There are a lot of now so-called conflict tourism. There you go, and representative of each group walk you through the streets and show you this representation of threat and this eternity of threat. You see, they always were there. On the same time, we really see, for example, in Greece, how idea of Ottoman Empire was as a threat was a little bit smoothed and removed, and a concentration become on this very deep history of Greece as a representation of its culture. And finally, legitimizing function, where we deal with threat to group status and support hegemonic narratives or endorse decolonization, emancipation, empowerment. A negative example is, for example, a Polish representation of victimhood, where Polish participation in Holocaust not just denied, but illegal. And what is represented is only Catholic victimhood during the Nazi regime. While what we see in the United States, it's very, for example, the empowerment of African Americans through not only presenting them as a victim of slavery, but those who were able to address, challenge the system, for example, this underground railroad. So I will stop sharing because I probably taken a lot of time, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Karina. Lots of important insights that are worthy of discussion, which we'll have later. So, Dennis Klein.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Carol Salina. That's some information I'd actually like to pick up from what you had just presented, and we'll try to do so. But in the meantime, let me explain very briefly what my objectives are, my research objectives, because I am looking at a third party to conflict that's often not brought into narratives. And I'm particularly interested, therefore, in looking at the onlookers or the bystanders or the passers-by. There's many ways that we can refer to folks who have been traditionally seen as outside the arena of conflict. I got into this question by with a book that I published a few years ago on survivors' memories and testimonies, and that their chief purpose, as they made very explicit, was to indict and condemn their perpetrators. But I had noted, and therefore wrote quite a bit about this, that they also were paying attention to their neighbors and what they expected from their neighbors. And it occurred to me that therefore conflict is not only about actors, but it can include those who are not acting, and that they too can present a threat and can escalate the conflict dynamics. And so I think this is a particularly rich and fertile area for research, and therefore I'd like to share some of that research with you. So let me get right over to this. These slides. So that's what I want to begin to consider here, is when actually inaction serves as a threat to what we have considered to be a two-party affair. And I'm now making the case that conflict is in fact a three-party affair. And so let me continue with this argument. To begin with, I'd like to help us understand how we traditionally understand bystanders and how they're conventionally treated in circumstances of conflict. So we can therefore begin to come up with all sorts of reasons, and scholars have done this incidentally, for why bystanders don't get involved, why they choose to remain on the periphery and prefer to remain invisible as non-actors in complex circumstances. So we don't need to go through all of these justifications or excuses, some of which are perfectly legitimate. And I am not arguing that bystanders need to get involved. There are good reasons why you and I don't get involved. in conflict circumstances. And that first reason that you can see here, the first bullet, is really the reason that I don't get involved as often as I suppose I could or should. There's a great deal of risk if we were to take action in a conflict that frankly doesn't really concern me. And I certainly wasn't a part of it, nor am I the cause of that conflict. So why should I therefore take that chance? And we can go down this list, but I want to go to therefore the last item on this list just to explain it briefly. There is a very popular explanation for why you and I do not get involved. And by the way, not only explanation, but again, justification for our inaction. And that's the famous bystander effect. The bystander effect means that if we were aware that other bystanders are observing a particular conflict, and here I'm looking at, say, street conflicts, then we don't believe that we need to get involved because others will. It's called, in other respects, the diffusion of responsibility. And it really is a classic case of having your cake and eat it too, because you do believe that some action will be taken. There's your responsibility, but it doesn't have to be me. So it is very true, and scholars have written a great deal about, therefore, reasons why bystanders are legitimately, let's say, innocent in this question. What I have begun to understand, however, is that the question of bystanders and our relationship to arenas of conflict is, if we were to take the perspective of the victim, then I think we get an altogether different understanding of the relationship of bystanders to conflict, and why, therefore, the inaction of bystanders presents a threat and can even lead to the escalation of conflict itself. And so in this classic example of testimony, if I can get over to that. Second. All right, let's get over there. All right, very good. Yeah, this was taken from actually a production by the Shoah Foundation at the University of Southern California. And let's take a look at this quote together. This is again from the perspective of someone who had been victimized. All of our so-called friends were standing on the sidelines shouting, "It's about time. You go out of here, and we don't need any Jews in our town." I'll come back to that reference in a moment. "We need to get rid of all you Jews." And I stood and I was speechless. The people I went to school with, their children, we were friends. We were sharing things together. Why were they so hostile? Why did they hate us all of a sudden? So a couple of points I want to make about this particular expression. First of all, I do want to focus our attention on the era known as the Holocaust or the Nazi era. And the reason I'm doing so is actually twofold. One, that happens to be an area of my research attention. But second is that we begin to see attention to bystanders during this particular era. That is to say, from 1933 to 1945. And we begin to understand, therefore, this question of the relationship of bystanders to conflict from the perspective of those who were victimized by the Nazis. Now, I'm focusing on the Western world, so to speak, that is to say, Europe and the United States. And therefore, when we begin to look at that, or those regions, we begin to see evidence of concern about what had to, up to that point, been seen as irrelevant or peripheral to conflict. And so there is some photographic evidence of this question of the relationship of the third, so to speak, to those who are involved in the conflict, that is to say, in the foreground. And we can see in this photograph from the 1930s a number of, onlookers, maybe former neighbors, people that those who have been compelled to needlessly and with humiliation scrub sidewalks, given the quote that you and I had just taken a look at, might well have been thinking, what about those who are looking on? Why are they doing so? And in one or two visible cases here with some glee, what is it that they are not doing that has made this particular instance of, yes, conflict or of tension between Jews and the authorities made worse by the inaction of those who are looking on? Furthermore, and many historians have made this argument, the onlookers far outnumber the perpetrators. So again, why not intervene? They have numbers on their side. Why can't they then prevent this from continuing to humiliate them and to further the pain of those who have been compelled to, in this case, needlessly scrub sidewalks? This is a photograph of a burning synagogue on the night of Kristallnacht, that is to say, in November 10 and 11, 1938. And again, in the background, we see destruction. In the foreground, we see a number of observers. What's going through their minds? I might well have been myself one of those observers. What could I have done to prevent this from happening or from making it less or preventing it from becoming even worse? And so there are, again, good reasons why folks do not get involved. But it's also important, should we understand this from the perspective of victims, that it has become compelling that they take some action to intervene. After all, they are desperate and they're looking for any means of assistance and support. So I am going to refer here to the classic term binary. This, from a victim's perspective, is a binary affair. It's either you or me, and you, the bystander, have the advantages. I don't. I'm helpless, I'm vulnerable, and I am threatened. Or in this photograph, again taken from this era, where you can see to the left a lot of folks who are lining up looking at this so-called parade of those men, and these are men in this particular picture, who have been rounded up, right? They're in their suits and ties, and so we can imagine that they were taken directly from their offices and were compelled, therefore, to march to their destinations, which at this point would be unknown to them. But what is not unknown to them are the number of folks who are looking on. And again, we can pick up on testimony to surmise that what they are thinking, at least in part, is why aren't all these folks, again, many of whom might have well been their neighbors, taking action, intervening, and preventing this type of thing from happening? I want to spend just a moment here on a rather well-known work by Elie Wiesel called Night. Many of you are familiar with that work that was published in the early 1960s. It is a standard article of assignment and discussion in schools and colleges and universities. And we have read a great deal about his experiences when Wiesel himself was going through this experience. And what we get from Night, the published work, is his very much concern about where was, in this case, God, as he refers to God often in this work, and why did God let this type of thing happen? Why did he, in other words, choose to be silent? But this work, Night, actually pre-existed in unpublished form. And I've been able to get my hands on the original manuscript of Night, written in the mid-1950s. And as you can see here, written in a language that would be known only to the insiders, that is to say, in the Yiddish language, which is a combination of Hebrew and the vernacular, or in this case, German. And he did write this, therefore, work that later became known as Night, as the world was silent. And here, therefore, he's not referring to God in God's silence in the published version, but really to the silence of his neighbors. All of the residents stood at the entrances of their homes with faces filled with happiness at the misfortune they saw in their friends of yesterday walking and disappearing into the horizon. Not for a day or two, but forever, here I learned the true face of the Hungarian, etc., and so forth. And it goes on. What I also want to point out here and indicate is how others, therefore, in Nazi Germany are beginning to pay attention to their neighbors. This is a statement by the rather well-known former rabbi in Berlin. He migrated to the United States and remained in his role as rabbi in Newark, New Jersey, quite well known, by the way, in certain circles in the United States, as he was well known in Berlin. And he published in 1935 this rather significant statement. It is the fate of the Jew to be without neighbor. The Jews of the small towns who live at the market square without neighbors, whose kids go to school without the neighbors' kids, they feel the isolation. I want to add here the word abandonment. And in the cohabitation of humans, it might be the hardest lot anyone can befall. We wouldn't feel all this with so much pain if it weren't for the feeling that we once had neighbors. And that becomes rather a significant observation, but I believe the terms or the extract of the sentence that stands out, certainly for me, is when he recognizes that the silence of his neighbors, now to quote again from this extract, is perhaps the hardest lot anyone can befall. And I find that an astonishing statement because, after all, the hardest lot is persecution. But really, it is their neighbors and the silence of their neighbors that really has struck them as perhaps the hardest lot. Some years later, in a memoir written by Simon Wiesenthal, again, I think known to many of you, called The Sunflower, he makes a similar kind of statement here. And that is right, it wasn't not just as wicked as persecution for people to look quietly without protest at human beings endure such shocking humiliation. There are many examples, therefore, we can jump to other examples, I'll do so quickly here, of this question of those who have been victimized looking not only to their persecutors, but to those who are looking on and choosing to remain silent. This is a famous statement from Martin Luther King in 1963. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and the actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. This whole question of bystanders actually became quite sensationalized in an event that took place the year after, in 1964, when the then metropolitan editor of the New York Times, Abraham Michael Rosenthal, assigned an article to Martin Gansberg 2 weeks after an incident occurred in Queens, New York. That incident was the murder of Kitty Genevieve's And what he had done, Rosenthal, was to assign this article not about the murder, but rather about the bystanders. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watch a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens, Queens. As I highlight here, they went on to state in this article that not one person telephoned the police. This has since been disproven. We know that folks did call the police, but as Professor Carol Stelina had mentioned, it's really not about what actually happened, the truth, but a compelling narrative that had emerged. And the narrative was that there are folks who stand by out of apathy, indifference, the malaise of our urban circumstances where we just prefer to remain anonymous. And Rosenthal had wanted to make a rather significant point, and he published a book later on that year about this particular point. It was called The 38 Witnesses. And that's what his concern was, is, as I say, it was a sensational story, and in a sense put the question of bystanders firmly on the map in the United States. Just one more observation, and then I'll end with this. And that is a reference to the incident that took place in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 with the attempt to integrate the public schools, or in particular the high school known as Central High. And one of those figures who was involved in this was Elizabeth Eckford. This was after she was prevented with her companions from entering the school at their first attempt on September 4th. She had to return, was compelled to do so, to her home. And as she was waiting for the bus at this particular bus stop, she later recalled what she was thinking. When I sat there September 4th, 1957, I felt terribly alone. I was encouraged by 2 reporters that were here. You can see them in this particular image. I was surrounded behind me by local reporters who took it upon themselves to be a human barrier between me and the angry demonstrators. And so I want to end here with this observation. She is referring to those, in this photograph, 3 apparent reporters. And that they were doing their job was one thing, but that Elizabeth Eckford saw them doing something else. And that is that they were providing, as she said, this human barrier. And she was encouraged by that. And so one of the thoughts I'd like to leave us with is, were we to understand how victims see you and me as bystanders that are no longer on the periphery, but by our inaction very much making matters worse, we might want to adopt the position that was adopted here by these reporters. Whether they did so intentionally, we don't know. And that is, they were in their way intervening. They provided for Elizabeth Eckford this barrier. And that's a role that you and I can consider. Rather than entering into the fray, I don't think anybody would want to turn around if I were a reporter and to take on these angry folks in the background. But there are other ways to provide assistance and support, and we should recognize that that's exactly what victims expect from us. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. These are fascinating cases. Okay, so moving on, I want to, okay, so I know that the themes that we just heard from Karina Porcelina and Dennis Klein will intersect with my topic, which is about threat salience of right-wing extremists. And I'm offering a social psychological perspective. What I'm talking about is an analysis of what might be considered a, a major political crisis in the United States today, which is the activism of right-wing extremist groups. And just by way of context here, the Southern Poverty Law Conference has identified 733 hate groups that are currently operating in the United States. And this there's been a lot of analysis about the number of incidents. And this intersects, of course, this topic of right-wing extremism intersects with what is called terrorist studies or studies of terrorism. And this graph just indicates basically the scale of terrorist attacks and plots between 1994 and 2021. In this graph, it just is an indication here, this larger space here, which is the light blue, represents violent right-wing extremism. I think it's significant also to notice that there is a substantial increase also by left-wing extremism as well. But the proportion is obviously quite different with right-wing extremist groups. So again, this graph is about attacks and plots in those years. Now, just some more information that of violent extremism in 2021, about of all the cases of violent extremism, the number of attacks by far right militants represents about half of all the attacks. The number of attacks by far left militants represents 40%, and then there are other groups that are smaller. So it's quite obvious that the number of attacks is greater by far right militants, but it's not insignificant that far left militants are also acting in violence. So let me just emphasize here that these studies of the number of violence attacks are important, but relatively shallow. If we try to understand what are the motives, the causes, the factors, the forces, the incentives, the drives, we need to examine, in my opinion, the social psychological underpinnings of these attacks. And I think there has been some work, but there needs to be a lot more work done to understand what drives these people to commit acts of violence, some of which are very dangerous to themselves. In some cases, the acts of violence basically are acts of militancy that put themselves at risk, obviously. And so what I'm interested in is the attention, and I want to emphasize the centrality of threat perception to their very identity, to their very sense of purpose, to their mission, to their cause, to their sense of who they are as a political group. The salience of threats are emotionally charged. These are not simply reducible to a reasoned and coherent ideology. These are reducible, in my opinion, to a kind of ethos, a set of beliefs that are intensely charged by emotion. where threat narratives are central to their collective identity. They offer a source and a cause and a rationale for their existence. And of course, they operate in lockstep with the aggression against their perceived enemy. So I'm focusing here on the social psychological underpinnings of right-wing extremism. Of course, this is a very complex topic, and so just in terms of context here, I am drawing upon some findings that were published recently in an article that came out in Peace and Conflict. This is an article I co-authored with David Stebbins, who's a doctoral student at the Carter School. And these are obviously some pictures of their protests. There's a lot of symbolism here that picture number 2 in particular showcases the symbolism of warriors, that much of their clothing is warrior imagery, their tattoos, and their obviously what they're wearing at these protests in many cases includes weapons. Picture number 3, the man in the center is Gavin McGintis, and he was the founder of the Proud Boys. By the way, the Proud Boys basically came into existence as a separate political group in 2016, and they are very active in engaging in many different kinds of conflicts, including the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. So in fact, as of December 31st, the Proud Boys are responsible for 83 incidents of crimes in the United States. During the prosecution of the Proud Boys for the Capitol breach on January 6th include 54 Proud Boys. That is, 54 Proud Boys have been prosecuted for their participation on January 6th. They come from many different states. Around the country. They're not limited to one particular region. And again, we need to understand the underpinnings of their work. So in our study, this is just, and I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously, for purposes of time, but they basically focus intensely and with great effort on their enemies, on their indignation, on their sense of victimization. And so, in fact, what I want to suggest is that there are 4 major emotionally intense beliefs that are advanced. And first is an intense indignation at the alleged brutality of their enemies. First of all, the Proud Boys define themselves male victims of, in particular, the liberalization of traditional gender roles, or they would say the destruction of traditional gender roles between men and women. They find, in particular, the activism of feminism in the past 50 years to be extremely damaging to not only to men, but to the entire country. Interlinked with that sense of male victimization is this perception of threats to Western civilization, which of course can be translated as European and white. That's their interpretation. That Western civilization is under serious threat by non-Western organization. And just as an example here, they say the true minority in the world are whites. White children are less than 3% of the world's population, and so on. There's many narratives about this. The second kind of emotionally intense belief is righteous rage, where righteous rage basically functions as a unifying force, which has the impact of intense anger and hatred against a series of enemy groups. And as I mentioned, in 2016, the group started by attacking feminists and Democrats, supporters of feminism. But the enemy list keeps changing with the political circumstance. It includes liberal Republicans, mainstream media, of course, immigrants, so-called communists, and in some cases, Jews, although the vilification of Jews is not as frequent as the attacks against feminists and Democrats. And I want to stress that righteous rage basically gives them a sense of power and is central to their operational principle. It is not just secondary or a minor temporary emotion. It is politicized as an important force that organizes their in-group solidarity and, of course, out-group vilification. And there are many examples of this. All I want to do is smash commies. Actually, I'm lying. I'm way past just hitting them. When the time comes, I will stop at nothing to fully eradicate them all. So by commies, this person meant Democrats, of course. And rage is a very, very compelling moral emotion, righteous rage, because it is personal and yet political. It's political in the sense that the performance of rage basically has a power over the sympathetic onlookers. One scholar called it emotional capital in the context of the extremists, as illustrated by enraged talk show hosts, or in some cases, enraged political figures. The third emotionally intense kind of belief is self-glory. And self-glory in the sense of the supremacy, obviously, of men over women, in the sense of the supremacy of Western civilization. And I want to stress that these are not exactly coherent ideological beliefs. These are emotionally captivating sentiments that are driven by a sense of internal moral purity. That is, when someone basically accentuates their supremacy, obviously it gives them a sense of moral purity and also authenticity. Another characteristic is that when they talk about this, they self-position as truth seekers, which basically gives them this sense of infallibility. A fourth emotionally intense kind of belief is a kind of ecstasy in the struggle itself. The struggle against the so-called enemies are kind of uplifting of their validity, their self-purity, as if they're cleansing. It gives them a power, a mastery over events, offering a sense of control. It gives them a sense of control that they are engaged against perceived enemies of the country. Also, the kind of pleasure comes from male bonding in the case of Proud Boys, which is very, very strongly advocated. Camaraderie and a sense of the warrior image. They take on this sense, the superficial trappings of being warriors. So this is very much motivating to them, all of which suggests what I would call a kind of fabricated set of beliefs that reflect a kind of habituated stupidity. And I don't say the word stupidity lightly. I really can suggest, I do suggest that they are living in a self-validating set of imaginary constructs of their own creation. They're living in a world that is distinct from any kind of world that can be corrected by so-called fact-checking, which is a very superficial enterprise. This habituated stupidity is evident as they define the social political world in absolutes of in-group good and out-group evil, which of course is not unique to the Proud Boys, obviously. One very common mode of thinking with this kind of stupidity is what's called timescaping. Timescape, it is being enraptured by time, temporality, and what's called monumental history, as Karina Korstalina points out in her presentation. It is a glorification of the past, and the claim is that glorification, the past, will be lost in a catastrophic future that aligned with the idea of a democratic clock of an extermination. So these are habituated practices that keep getting reinforced in many different ways. And I just want to leave with one suggestion, that the ethos of right-wing extremism intersects, I think, deeply with what might be called political narcissism. So you know what narcissism is for individuals. It's excessive self-love. It's a feeling of supremacy, infallibility, of being grandiose, this grandiose characteristic. And it also, importantly, individual narcissism intersects with devaluation of others who threaten supremacy. Well, I think that we can identify these factors in the Proud Boys and other extremist groups as collective narcissism, which centers on an irrational, or I might say otherworldly, exceptionalism. It's excessive group love, the sense of exceptionalism, this secure feeling of supremacy, supremacy by genes or gender or God, power. Of course, that's not unique to the Proud Boys, certainly. And it's particularly important with collective narcissism. It is enragement at the threats to such exceptionalism. So I see that the four kinds of emotionally intense beliefs that I just mentioned are indications of this political narcissism. So I will stop here, and now I would like to ask Matt to suggest or invite people to raise questions, comments, either through the chat or through
okay. Well, thank you to the presenters and to all the audience. Those were great presentations. I think you would agree with me on that. I wouldn't take the risk of trying to summarize all the great insights that came up from these presentations. So I'll just turn to the audience and ask you to briefly ask your questions in the chat, or make comments and observation briefly. And for that, you can raise your hands. But for the questions, you can ask them in the chat. If you want to direct them to a specific presenter, please mention it. Okay, thank you. We'll take one question at a time, and this would make answers easier. So let me start with Sterling.
Thank you so very much. This is very important to me. I'm a peace practitioner, and one of the things that I try to do pragmatically is to work with groups where there's group intimidation and there's this idea of memory and truth. I'm wondering, and this is a question to all three presenters, I'm wondering what is your insight in pragmatic intervention when it comes to allowing intervention with the idea of memory and identity that brings people apart? What are some key insights you have, or authors, or you know, ideals that you might share with us?
Okay, I can start. So this is the question which you ask, and it's one of the key questions, right, in dealing with societies, post-conflict societies or conflict societies, where antagonism in historical representation. For example, in Ukraine, which we know now there is a war, but speaking about pre-war Ukraine, major divisions which people referred to were not referred to language or to ethnicities. They were exactly about this interpretation of history, and I've done a lot of research on it and showing how it is belief, in particular interpretation of history, divide people across multiple countries. What to do about it? There are multiple ways now. There are theoretical approaches and practice approach. One of the key approach for me, which I believe works very well, is so-called agonistic approach to history, which is developed in European scholarship, but then brought also into United States and other places. In comparisons with antagonistic approach to history, then there is only true one, the whole belief in historic truth is become challenged. An idea that people can have different accounts or different interpretation of the same events, and that having different ways how we interpret history should not be a threat. Speaking about threat, should not be a threat to the groups, and we have to find ways where we can find cross-cutting interpretation across it and acknowledge existence of different historical interpretations. Of course, it should be like the extremism, as Professor Rothbart stressed, that it's extremism which lead to violence, but existence of multiple interpretation, ability to negotiate representation of history, ability to work on it, it's one of the key for people, again, moving from this competition into coexistence through organism of histories. There is also multi-perspectivity, which is stressed by multiple research, mostly in history education, but also now brought into mnemonic work in communities. And also we see that the community dialogues on historical interpretation through contact, but also building on a history and bridging people together toward defining common goals, common identities. It's a very important approach. So there are multiple, again, approaches how you work with this historical interpretation, because unfortunately, it's one of the key aspects of violence.
If I could add to that, I totally agree with Karina Korsenina's analysis. I think what we need to focus on are techniques that foster an ethos of sympathetic understanding. A kind of a set of practices that recognizes the other, their enemy, as complex, as people who themselves are suffering, and to foster a hope of their curiosity about their perceived enemy. And in the case of the Proud Boys, this could be illustrated by basically showing the complexity of women's stories. Now, what I'm saying is obviously very idealistic and, you know, with no detail with this conversation. But I think it needs to delve deeply into the emotional life of the Proud Boys and the extremists.
You know, if I could just add, I know that we don't have a lot more time, but it was an interesting question. And I do want to pick up on some of the terminology that we have been looking at this session, and that is collective memory and narratives or narrativity. And I think it has a great deal of bearing on that relationship between bystanders and incidents of conflict. Brief examples is, why do bystanders or some individuals take that risk or find a way of getting involved? And here I want to suggest that there are certain affinities that I think that bystanders nurture. So that, for example, in the case of the Nazi era, by that point in the 1930s, the so-called other, in this case the Jews, was so far beyond the circle of friendships that they were seen clearly as, and we use the term a great deal, but in this case it truly applies, as truly the other, the enemy, and therefore they don't deserve our support or intervention. This was true in the Kitty Genovese case as well. A woman back in the 1960s, just outside of a local bar, didn't matter that it had closed hours before the incident, but they drew some assumptions, those who were looking on, that this individual may well have deserved her punishment, et cetera, and so forth. So I think that memory, narratives that individuals and now collectivities adopt may well determine whether or not they take any action to get involved.
I'm going to have to intervene. We are running out of time, and I definitely want to hear everybody. And I think I'm sorry for basically organizing this that in a way that took more time for us speakers. But we can continue.
Okay, yes, there are questions in the chat that are more or less related to what you've just said and to the Sterling's question. I wonder whether I will not read them before moving to the next person who raised their hands. Kyla asked, what makes a bystander and how do you draw the line? Are there direct witnesses and people who know who avoid knowing about the conflict? And Parker and Heather also asked questions about the narcissism and self-glorifications that you mentioned when talking about the the Proud Boys psychology, and she would like also to know whether the right-wing media, such as the books and the Turner Diaries, play into the narcissism aspect of right-wing extremism.
Well, I'll mention that there's no question that the books and the Turner Diaries, and this action of narcissism, by some estimates, 90% are through social media. That is, the platform, the setting is through social media, which obviously has its own algorithms for intensifying extremism that's been well documented. And so the input of the statements of the Turner Diaries and others basically contribute. That's where the action comes in of the social psychology. That's where so much of the action is through the social media platforms, through this ideology.
Okay, let's.
If I can, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Move to Rebecca and allow her to ask her question or make her comments. Rebecca.
Oh, there's two Rebeccas.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Rebecca Cataldi.
I see, and Dr. Rebecca Nicholson. So Rebecca Cataldi, yes.
Okay, thank you. My question is for Daniel. I was wondering if there's any distinction made in the research on far-right extremisms between people who generally feel a sense of threat and a fear from that threat versus people who might not really feel threatened, but they use that sense of threat as a justification to justify their prejudices toward the other, or to, you know, for sort of propaganda to bring other people into the movement. Do you see any sort of distinction, and does that affect what the response, what a constructive response might be in trying to address threat perception within the far right? If you have any recommendations.
You mean the distinction between people who really genuinely feel it versus those who exploit it for political purpose? Is that the distinction you're asking?
Yeah, for political purpose, or even for identity purpose, for, you know, kind of a self-justification.
Well, I think a threat narrative in performance is always power. It's always a force in a public space, whether the space is through the social media or whatever. So it's always a force. It always has a potential impact. It always has emotional capital. And some people, I'm more interested in that force. And obviously, some people have the platform to exert tremendous power with these emotionally charged threat narratives. So at the end of the day, I think the distinction is circumstantial, but not fundamentally different in kind. Anybody who has in a public space who basically perceives a threat also has that potential impact on fellow, like-minded people in the space, like a political platform, political rally, a political speech, or a talk show host like Alex Jones.
And do you have any recommendation for addressing that?
Yeah, right, exactly. That goes to the first important question of the conversation. Again, I think we need to delve into the complexity, basically create an ethos of promoting among these people, looking at their perceived enemies as complex human beings and drawing upon basically positive history, invoking Karina Porcelina's theme, that basically drawing upon the memories of collaboration, of positive history, and also basically focusing on, and you know this very well as an expert in conflict resolution, having a commitment to a shared vision about the future. Sometimes a discussion about the future may be less incendiary and less divisive than about the past.
Yeah, I think I wanted to stress that it's because this is about the threat, the whole system, that one of the key dealing with these issues is really understanding functioning of threat and reducing any foundations for all types of threats. Because while especially if majority feel threat to their position, they will be less likely. There are a huge amount of research, so they will be less likely to support social change. So there are multiple research was coming how to deal, how to allow this collaboration, how to allow acceptance, how to allow this approach of mutual work, like creation of alliances for social change. And this is very important for conflict resolution.
Thank you. Anna, in fact, in the chat, had raised almost the same question and was asking Professor Rothbart whether he has identified any corresponding strategies to overcome these rooted emotional responses, collective narcissism, and righteous rage. I hope that, Anna, you got an answer to your question. Anna? Is she still there?
Yes. Hi. I think that was really helpful, kind of in learning how to engage with the history and imagining possible futures, kind of as a way to step away maybe from those more rooted emotional responses and envision possibilities instead.
Okay. Thank you.
I see someone is waiting.
Dr. Nicholson, can you now ask your question?
Yes, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to thank the panelists because all of this information it's incredibly pertinent to us as conflict resolution professionals. I'd like to make some observations as somebody who's been in politics and has been in the field of conflict resolution for many years now, and then pose a question. One of the challenges to looking at domestic threats politically and wondering and asking these questions about why we do not intervene. I'm watching as these same conversations take place that talk about history. We've watched history. History has been recorded. Greg Stanton and others have recorded what is happening politically in a society that leads to genocide. So last year, when everybody's talking about will there be civil war would be the nicest thing that would happen. The road and the political conditions we have right now lead somewhere much darker. And I'm listening to the conversation be reframed, for example, political narcissism, forgive me, doctor. But we know what this is already. These are not conditions that look different than they have looked in other societies where the same things perpetuate. So some vulnerabilities that I have seen in listening to these conversations in Homeland Security discussions and in academic discussions is that we, as Americans who have grown up in the United States, we have a bias. We have an inherent bias because we are trying from a culturally emic perspective to examine the culture that we grew up in. And from somebody who grew up in conservative Republican politics and somebody who is immersed and has family in conservative Republican politics. This is not how I think anymore, but I hear the mark being missed over and over and over. And so I'm wondering if we have work like Greg Stanton, if we have work like James Waller, who has talked about the individual levels at which societies and individuals make their choices leading to mass murder and genocide, right? We have the roadmaps already. So my question, why is it that we're reframing these situations and discussing them in different terms rather than focusing on how we can provide intervention on the part of bystanders right now.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Okay,
go ahead, Dan.
Greg. Go ahead, Dennis. Sorry, I was thinking of
Yeah.
Greg Stanton. Dennis.
No, I think this is, look, we're all struggling with these problems because it seems as if there should be more action and not less. I think we're living in a very quiescent period that demands greater response. I don't have an answer for that. I know that there are folks who can justify the lack of response, as I've talked about it. We know that victims are in a position of appealing to and demanding. So this much we know. But to answer the question, therefore, why isn't there a response? You know, maybe I should leave it up to you and to others to help us understand why, in a period of time that you would think would demand so much more of a response, and we're getting very little of it from people certainly on the street. And I don't know the answer to that. I think we, in some respects, feel paralyzed. Maybe we're numbed by so much incident in our, lives, in our awareness, that we feel like it's just beyond our reach. I mean, these are speculative, but I think your question deserves a great deal more inquiry and investigation.
So let me add to what Dennis said. Dr. Nicholson, thank you so much for your insights here. I see your question as two parts. The first is analysis and the second is intervention, if I may say. So the analysis, there's nothing that we said today, in my opinion, that precludes the deeper dive into social political structure and historical structures that is evident, illustrated in Greg Stanton's important work. There's nothing that we said that precludes that. It's just a focus, at least in my presentation, trying to delve into the micro process of conversations of Proud Boys, but bringing it back into the, are Proud Boys agents or are they subjects of structures? And the answer is both. So they are agents for change, and they are also subjects. I don't want to use the word victims, but they are subjects of large social, political, and historical process. And the history, which this intersects also with Greg Stanton's important analysis, that the enculturated history of vilification of people is deeply embedded in American society. This history that is a deep part, it is not only the original sin of slavery, which is obvious, an obvious important insight, but it is something about the psyche where the American culture needs to feel elevated and morally pure by identifying an endless series of enemies. With the Proud Boys and these other groups, the enemy list keeps changing and keeps circling back for various reasons, but the need for that vilification for in-group, whatever, validation and in my opinion, supremacy and narcissism, that need is persistent in our society. And that is the large lens which we need to take to understand the details of one right-wing group, another right-wing group, and so on. So there's commonality there.
Thank you for your comments. I would add something else here. If we look back at literature that looks at violent extremism, specifically with the Ku Klux Klan in America, we can find a lot of really relevant information today. And specifically, what's being missed is the socialization of these groups. So we're focusing on one person acting, but forgetting that there's an entire range of families, of churches, of communities, of all kinds of people that support and enable these types of things. So when we're talking about the ability for bystander intervention, there's a lot of opportunity that's being missed when we just vilify these people. And there's another vulnerability that Homeland Security recognizes male domination as one of the major threats of American terrorism right now, of domestic terrorism. And just from a socialized perspective, I watch how nobody wants to touch that, because that's something that happens in our workplaces, it happens in our dating situations, it happens in our government, it happens in academia, it happens everywhere, and nobody wants to be the one to say it. So it doesn't matter, by the time somebody has a gun, by the time somebody's made that decision, there's an entire process of socialization that we have decided is not our problem to talk about from the bystanders. So what is our problem and how we are supposed to interact with these issues? There's a lot more room for individual intervention than is currently being explored. And this is my point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So briefly, if I can respond again to that reference to bystanders. Again, all very good. These are important questions. My initial response, and we'll probably get into a little debate about this one, is that I don't believe the task is alone, in any case, is about the infrastructure that enables your reference. That's a lot to work with and to work against. I believe the active intervention is necessary when conflict actually occurs. We're going to have a big debate about that particular observation. But I think what, in terms of enabling, is to make an effort, which I don't see happening, to truly understand the so-called other side and what threatens them, and how maybe at the macro level, at the wholesale level, we begin to change possibly the culture. But that's taking on a lot of work. We have hard enough work in just responding to the phenomenon of threat as it becomes visible and palpable in our society. That, to me, is the point at which we have responsibilities. Deeper than that, I think, is beyond our reach. But again, we can debate that point.
And I also want to add that while like Stanton's work is wonderful and he really brought a lot of ideas, that there are huge critical scholarship which emerged recently, which brings into discussion and contention issue of victimhood, issue of marginalization. We really have to understand that victimhood is not zero-sum game. We really have to understand that a lot of perpetration came from marginalization. So there are a lot of very interesting critical issues regarding the power dynamics, exclusion and inclusion, which should be taken into account without just easily put this dualistic perception of victim perpetrator, just to add to complexity.
I'm going to have to intervene, I hope not inappropriately. We are way over time right now, and I think we're going to bring this to an end, and I am so grateful for my colleagues, Dennis Klein and Karina Porostelina, for their insights and fantastic questions, comments, and insights that are obviously important as we move forward. And frankly, I'm going to use some of your questions as motivating for my personal continued research on these. In particular, the question about pragmatic intervention, pragmatic oriented interventions that our field, I think, needs to pursue, but I certainly do. So, and thank you to Matt Barry, for your assistance on this. I really appreciate that. And to all for making this and I'm an impartial observer here, making this a very, very successful event.